hit the brakes for us.
Step back into the 1970s, a time of bold dreams and even bolder mistakes. From fuel-guzzling engines to cramped, questionable interiors, these RVs were more endurance test than adventure. Buckle up as we take a wild ride through the decade's most infamous motorhome disasters. 1970 Dodge Chinook. So, the Dodge Chinook, a name that suggests elegance and speed. Unfortunately, this RV was neither. The Chinook was built on the Dodge van chassis, which sounds like a solid idea, except for the small detail that it was wildly underpowered. With its measly V8 engine barely managing to move its hefty bulk, this RV strained so hard it sounded like it was begging for an early retirement every time you hit a slight incline. Inside, the Chinook promised a cozy, compact living experience, but in reality, it was more like living in a shoebox. The layout was designed by someone who seemingly hated comfort. Sleeping quarters were cramped, the kitchenette was smaller than your average microwave, and the bathroom? Let's just say you'd be better off with a bucket and some dignity. What made this RV truly shocking was the level of maintenance it demanded. Leaky roofs, shoddy electrical systems, and insulation that did nothing to stop the summer heat or winter chill made it the ultimate endurance test for owners. If you ever hear someone brag about surviving a summer in a Dodge Chinook, they've earned the right to call themselves a warrior. And let's not forget the fuel efficiency, or lack thereof. The Chinook drank gas like a frat bro at happy hour. At a pitiful 8 miles per gallon, on a good day, you'd spend more time at the gas station than on the open road. Here's a fun fact: the Chinook was so poorly insulated that it essentially had two climate settings, sauna in the summer and icebox in the winter. And let's not forget the charming maintenance quirks. For example, leaky roofs were so common that owners referred to their vehicle as rolling rain barrels. Bonus points for the plumbing system, which often required more duct tape than a middle school science project. These beauties cost around $10,000 in the 1970s, roughly $70,000 today. Imagine dropping Tesla money on something that handles like a sloth on roller skates. 1972 Winnebago Brave. The Winnebago Brave promised freedom and adventure, but delivered something closer to vehicular Stockholm Syndrome. Its exterior was adorned with a garnish orange stripe that somehow managed to make a bad design worse. This RV was as aerodynamic as a brick and handled like one too. The Brave's engine was a gas-guzzling monstrosity that made sure you didn't go far or fast. A top speed of about 55 miles an hour made merging onto highways a thrill-seeker's dream, and the engine often overheated just to keep you on your toes. Owners joked that it was more dependable as a stationary guest house than as a moving vehicle. Inside, the decor was a celebration of 1970s horror. Think brown shag carpets, mustard yellow upholstery, and fake wood paneling that screamed, "I hate beauty." The cramped living quarters were a constant reminder of the Brave's ironic name. Even the beds were a challenge, with thin, lumpy mattresses that felt like sleeping on a pile of cinder blocks. Reliability? Forget it. The Brave broke down so often that owners formed tight-knit communities at roadside mechanics. In a bizarre way, it did create a sense of camaraderie. Nothing bonds people like shared suffering. The Winnebago Brave was brave only in name. With its signature orange stripe, it looked like a creamsicle but performed like a melting one. Powered by a thirsty V8, the Brave could hit 55 miles per hour if you believed in miracles. Highway merging wasn't just a challenge, it was an adrenaline sport. Inside, it was pure 1970s kitsch. Mustard yellow upholstery, shag carpeting, and wood paneling that screamed, "Why not brown everywhere?" The beds, if you can call them that, felt like someone filled a pillowcase with bricks. Here's the kicker: this rolling relic was a community builder, mostly because owners bonded while waiting for tow trucks. Between overheating engines and perpetually failing transmissions, the Brave was less of a motorhome and more of a stationary hobby. 1973 FMC 2900R. Alright, the FMC 2900R was supposed to be a luxury motorhome, but it was more like an overpriced experiment gone horribly wrong. Developed by a company that previously made military vehicles, the 2900R's heavy-duty heritage didn't translate to everyday usability. For starters, this thing cost as much as a small house back in the 1970s. Adjusted for inflation, you'd be paying Ferrari money for a vehicle that handled like a shopping cart with a wonky wheel. Its suspension system was so stiff that every pothole felt like a punch to the kidney. Inside, the FMC tried to pass off gaudy as glamorous. The interior was crammed with impractical design choices, mirrored walls, unnecessarily heavy cabinetry, and lighting that looked like it belonged in a disco. The layout felt more like a maze than a living space, and navigating it while the vehicle was in motion was a guaranteed way to collect bruises. Mechanically, the FMC was a nightmare. Its complex systems broke down often, and finding parts was like searching for Bigfoot. Owners spent more time with mechanics than with their families. Which is probably why the FMC earned the nickname Financial Maintenance Catastrophe. The FMC 2900, proof that even companies that make tanks can mess up luxury. This $27,000 beast, a cool $140,000 in today's money, was marketed as the Rolls-Royce of motorhomes. The suspension, borrowed from military tech, ensured that you felt every pebble on the road. The FMC came with mirrored walls and disco lighting, which might have been cool if you weren't too busy nursing whiplash from its jerky driving. Fun fact, its unique aluminum shell was great for weight reduction, but also turned the interior into an oven in summer and a freezer in winter. Only about 1,000 were ever made because buyers quickly realized that maintaining one was like owning a Ferrari, if Ferraris had toilets that broke every month. 1977 Apollo 3000. Yes, the Apollo 3000 was ambitiously named after NASA's space missions, but the only thing it had in common with rockets was the alarming amount of smoke it produced when running. This RV was built by a company that had no experience in the RV industry, and boy did it show. The Apollo's body was made of thin fiberglass panels that were prone to cracking and peeling. In windy conditions, it felt like driving a giant kite, an unpredictable and terrifying experience. And then there was the engine, which seemed to give up on life halfway through every road trip. Inside, the Apollo 3000 was a shrine to poor craftsmanship. The furniture was flimsy, the appliances often didn't work, and the plumbing? Let's just say if you valued hygiene, you wouldn't use the shower. The water heater frequently failed, leaving travelers to enjoy ice-cold baths. The shocking part was how quickly these RVs depreciated in value. What cost a fortune new was practically worthless after a couple of years. It was almost as if the Apollo 3000 was built to self-destruct the moment the warranty expired. Inside, you were treated to thin walls, a perpetually cold shower, and appliances that worked about as often as you won the lottery. The Apollo's depreciation curve? Steep enough to make Bitcoin look stable. Despite the chaos, some owners swear by it as a collector's item, mainly for the novelty of owning something so legendarily bad. 1973 Coachmen Leprechaun. So, the Coachmen Leprechaun promised magic but delivered mayhem. Its whimsical name belied a plethora of problems that made owning one a test of patience and sanity. First, let's address the handling, or lack thereof. The Leprechaun felt like driving a jellyfish on wheels. Every turn and gust of wind sent it swaying dangerously, making even experienced drivers question their life choices. Add to that a transmission that seemed to have a mind of its own, and you've got a recipe for road rage. The interior was a masterclass in how not to design a living space. Tiny windows let in barely any light, creating a dim, depressing atmosphere. The beds were notoriously uncomfortable, and the storage was so poorly planned that even packing light felt like a game of Tetris. But here's the real kicker. The Leprechaun was plagued by electrical issues. Lights flickered unpredictably, appliances short-circuited, and the battery drained faster than you could say shamrock. Many owners joked that the only magical thing about this RV was how quickly it turned money into misery. The Leprechaun promised a pot of gold and delivered fool's gold. Driving it felt like herding cats on a windy day. It swayed, wobbled, and made every turn a white-knuckle event. The dim interior and cramped beds ensured that you'd miss home the second you stepped in. And oh, the electrical system? Lights flickered like a haunted house, and the battery drained faster than a toddler on Halloween candy. Despite all its flaws, the Leprechaun was popular enough to survive several redesigns. Guess some people just like living dangerously. 1975 Travco 270. The Travco 270, with its sleek, curvy body, looked like something out of the Jetsons. Unfortunately, it performed more like something out of Gilligan's Island. This so-called luxury motorhome was essentially a fiberglass shell bolted onto a Dodge chassis, and that's where the problems began. The first shocker, the Travco 270's weight distribution was so bad that it often felt like driving a teeter-totter. Every turn was a gamble, and crosswinds turned it into a rolling panic attack. Owners frequently joked that if you wanted to feel alive, forget skydiving. Just take the Travco Travco on a windy day. Inside, the RV looked promising until you actually started using it. The layout was confusing, with furniture placed in ways that maximized stubbed toes. The kitchen appliances were notoriously unreliable, often requiring a swift kick to function. Meanwhile, the bathroom was a claustrophobic nightmare, with fixtures that seemed to disintegrate at the mere hint of use. What really earned the Travco a spot on this list was its horrendous reliability. Engine failures were almost guaranteed on long trips, and spare parts were as rare as unicorn. If you owned a Travco, you basically became best friends with your local tow truck driver. The Travco 270 was featured in several movies as a futuristic vehicle. Ironically, most of those movies were post-apocalyptic. 1974 Barth Motorhome. Barth Motorhomes were marketed as high-end vehicles, and to be fair, their gleaming aluminum exteriors turned heads. But like a bad date, the shiny exterior hid a world of dysfunction. This RV was a classic case of looks good on paper, falls apart in practice. The Barth's big selling point was its customizability, but this often backfired spectacularly. Owners were lured by the promise of bespoke interiors, only to end up with mismatched cabinets, awkward layouts, and a luxury feel that screamed DIY disaster. The result? A Frankenstein-like creation that was as impractical as it was expensive. Mechanically, the Barth was an absolute diva. Its engines were prone to overheating, the brakes often failed at the worst moments, and the suspension was so bad it could rattle fillings loose. And let's not even get started on the wiring, which had all the reliability of a discount Christmas light set. Surprisingly, Barth Motorhomes still fetch decent prices today, probably because collectors are nostalgic for suffering. Owning one is less about the joy of travel and more about the challenge of keeping the thing running. Barth Motorhomes were the flashy divas of the RV world. With polished aluminum exteriors, they screamed luxury, but under the hood, they were prima donnas. The brakes often worked about as well as your Wi-Fi during a thunderstorm. Customization was Barth's claim to fame, but it usually resulted in design monstrosities that made IKEA furniture look elegant. And yet, collectors adore them today. Nostalgia is weird like that. 1973 GMC Motorhome. The GMC Motorhome looked like a spaceship and promised futuristic innovation. Sadly, it delivered futuristic levels of disappointment. It was one of the first motorhomes with front-wheel drive and a low-profile design, which sounds cool until you realize it drove like a poorly trained circus elephant. Its innovative suspension system, inspired by aircraft technology, was supposed to provide a smooth ride. Instead, it turned the RV into a bouncy castle on wheels. The front-wheel drive, while novel, made it horrendous to maintain, with parts that were both expensive and impossible to find. Inside, GMC tried to combine style and function, but ended up with something that felt like a 1970s bachelor pad gone wrong. The carpeted walls, yes, walls, were a cleaning nightmare, and the seating arrangements made socializing awkward at best and impossible at worst. The futuristic kitchen looked cool, but lacked storage and functionality, leaving travelers with nowhere to put their canned beans. Adding insult to injury, the GMC Motorhome had a penchant for breaking down at the worst times. Overheating engines, failing brakes, and electrical meltdowns were just part of the fun. If you owned one, you probably became an amateur mechanic by necessity. The GMC Motorhome had a low profile and front-wheel drive, innovative for its time. But innovation doesn't mean good. Its suspension was basically a trampoline, and maintaining the drivetrain required a degree in engineering. Inside, it was the 70s incarnate, shag everything, minimal storage, and a layout that turned every meal into a balancing act. If you wanted reliability, you bought a Ford. If you wanted headaches, this was your jam. 1973 Dodge Balboa. The Dodge Balboa was marketed as a compact, affordable RV. Translation, it was tiny, cheap, and riddled with problems. Its diminutive size was its only redeeming quality. Great for parking, but terrible for everything else. Driving the Balboa felt like wrestling with a drunk shopping cart. It was top-heavy, prone to tipping, and had the acceleration of a lazy sloth. Hills were a no-go unless you wanted to spend half your trip crawling along at 5 miles per hour with a trail of angry drivers behind you. The interior was a slapdash affair, with corners cut so severely you could practically hear the designer saying, "Good enough." Thin walls provided no insulation or privacy, and the built-in furniture seemed to disintegrate if you sneezed too hard. The kitchenette was so cramped that cooking anything more complicated than a cup of instant noodles felt like an Olympic event. What really sealed the Balboa's fate was its build quality, or lack thereof. Roofs leaked, windows rattled, and the entire vehicle felt like it might disassemble itself on bumpy roads. If you ever see a Balboa on the road today, it's either been heavily restored or held together by duct tape and hope. Compact and lightweight, the Balboa was great if you didn't mind sacrificing everything. It was so top-heavy that cornering felt like piloting a seesaw. 1972 Grumman Motorhome. Yes, that Grumman, the company that made fighter planes and postal trucks, tried its hand at motorhomes. But what was the result? A vehicle that combined the aerodynamic finesse of a brick with the comfort of a metal storage shed. The Grumman Motorhome was built to be durable, but in practice, this meant it was heavy, unwieldy, and impossible to repair. It felt like driving a tank, which sounds fun until you realize tanks don't make great recreational vehicles. The steering was so heavy it could double as a workout, and the turning radius made it nearly impossible to navigate tight roads. Inside, the Grumman was pure utility with zero charm. Metal surfaces dominated the interior, giving it all the warmth of a public restroom. The furniture was about as comfortable as park benches, and the layout was laughably impractical, with key amenities shoved into inconvenient corners. And here is the kicker. Despite its industrial pedigree, the Grumman was shockingly unreliable. It suffered from constant mechanical issues, from failing transmissions to persistent electrical problems. Owners quickly learned that built to last didn't apply to anything beyond the frame. Despite its issues, the Grumman's frame has been repurposed for everything from food trucks to mobile workshops. Turns out, it was better at everything except being an RV.